Last summer, homelessness was an issue being discussed by many in Greenfield. And in August, the mayor and Board of Health stepped in and said homeless people could not camp on the Greenfield Town Common, which about 20 people had been doing since June. After that, some of those people ended up in shelters, others remained living on the streets. Now, the sudden deaths last month of Kathleen Grady and Clayton Wheeler, who were homeless, has some people in the community questioning how homelessness should be addressed. For perspective on this matter, I spoke with Elizabeth Bienz of ServiceNet, which is a resource agency for the homeless and others, and Greenfield City Councilor Karen Rudy Renaud.
When they were dispersed, some people just went back into the woods, and there's an encampment behind McDonald's, and that's where a lot of folks went. There were some that went to the shelter, but I think the majority of people just went, they stayed outside, but they went to the back of McDonald's.
And so for you, I've heard you say publicly you were concerned that this would turn into kind of out of sight, out of mind for these people. Do you think that that is what has happened?
I mean, absolutely. Once the town common, once the do not cross yellow tape went up and the grass started growing, it was no longer part of the public discourse. Not so much. I mean, there have been some things put in place to look at, long term, how do we prevent this? And there's a Greenfield Affordable Housing Project Committee that's looking at how do we fill in these gaps in housing. But in terms of as much as people were talking about it then, it's not the same. It's only come back around because of the deaths that happened.
And we'll talk about that more in a minute. It was tragic. Elizabeth, for your part, you work with ServiceNet, which is one of the service providers in the area that works with the homeless community, among other things. Following the camping being banned on the town common in Greenfield, did you see or hear from these about 20 people who had been living there?
Yeah, I think some of the folks who had been living on the common stayed in touch with case managers. Some people wanted to come into the shelter. Some people did come into the shelter. And also some people who chose to remain outside or in other arrangements have remained in touch. And I think they share, the concern that they would be out of sight, out of mind also, after that point.
And do you feel like that has also been the case?
Yeah.
So what can be done about that?
I think the greatest need is for more subsidized housing in the community. Additional shelter space would certainly be helpful, but some folks are not going to be comfortable to access a shelter, and I think that we saw that with this couple who passed away.
And Rudy, you mentioned that there had been an encampment behind McDonald's, which is where these two people who passed away were found. It was a very cold night. The district attorney's office still hasn't said, while they suspect no foul play, they haven't directly said this was a result of it being so cold, so we're awaiting that. But people in the community suspect that it was a very cold night, too cold to be sleeping outside. Is that right?
From what I'm understanding, there was a propane heater inside the tent. And of course, like the toxicology report hasn't come back officially yet, but it seems as though they had probably died from poisoning trying to keep warm. So it was a direct result of the cold.
And one of the reasons, as I understand it, that people ended up on the common or came to the common is because some of those camping sites elsewhere in the community had been deemed inappropriate and unlawful by the city. Is that one of those camping sites that was said to be not, though the city came out and said, you shouldn't be here, you shouldn't be using this land?
The one behind McDonald's, folks, there's not a problem with people staying there. There used to be one in town, I'm sure Elizabeth knows about, the Jungle, called the Jungle, and it was actually the railroad, Amtrak. They own the land there, and also it was dangerous because I think people were too close to the railroad tracks, so that's why that one got broken up many years ago. Yeah.
And so when things like this happen, when people are moved off of properties, what's the next step? Does ServiceNet reach out to them? You mentioned some of these people had been in touch with caseworkers at ServiceNet. How do you work with the homeless population in these circumstances?
We work with people around applying for available housing in the area, getting into shelter if they choose, or trying to make arrangements with other people they may be able to stay with temporarily. We help people apply for public programs they may be eligible for to help with basic needs, like the SNAP program or disability benefits. We help people look for work to try to get back on their feet in different ways, depending on what they need.
Given this particular case with the Common, the fact that there wasn't an immediate place for these folks to go, whether it's subsidized housing or those additional shelter beds, which I understand are quite tight right now in Greenfield, do you think that the city made the wrong call by following the health recommendations from city and then ultimately the mayor saying you have to leave the Common?
I don't necessarily think it was just the fact that folks had to leave the Common. I think it could have been prevented if there were warming centers, whether or not people were standing, were in place on the Common or somewhere else. I think if there are other alternatives, ServiceNet can't be the only one responsible for all the homeless in Greenfield. I mean, it has to be a community endeavor, and I think government has to work with the social service agencies, and I think also one thing that's relevant to this conversation that I actually just found out on my way here is that Bay State's closing the mental health unit at Franklin and at Noble and at Wing. And that's disturbing because that's, mental health is part of the reason why sometimes people are homeless. It's the economy, it's mental health, it's addiction. And so, that's part of it has to be a team effort to try to get folks into stable housing, and part of that is mental health services.
I hear what you're saying about Bay State and about ServiceNet, but my question was more about the city's responsibility in all of this, because it started with the city saying, no, you have to go, when the town ordinance didn't say that was a place where it didn't prohibit people from actually staying on that Common overnight.
I think the city can and should open warming centers. We have the capacity to do it. We have these buildings. We have you need sprinkler systems, and you need staff. And we could get the staff from ServiceNet that are trained, and we could open up a high school, and that's what they do in other cities. And yeah, I do think that the city
So maybe
should do
not
that.
getting stuck on that small piece of legalese. Not that sprinkler systems aren't very important. Fire suppression, certainly that could be a public safety problem if that were to arise.
Yeah.
But maybe overlooking that in the short term while you have these frigid temperatures.
Oh yeah, because not everybody, like Elizabeth said, not everybody wants to go to the shelter. It's not that they're not welcome, but there might be somebody there that they don't want to see, or there might be some kind of trauma. So there has to be other options. Yeah.
I want to zoom out for a minute because I was looking at some housing and urban development statistics, and late last year a report came out saying that homelessness in Massachusetts was at a significant rise. About 20,000 people across the state are now homeless, and that's higher than we've seen in almost a decade, as I understand it from those statistics. What do you think is driving that trend?
In Greenfield, I definitely see a rise in rent. I've worked in the ServiceNet shelter program for about 10 years, and in that time, rent has gone up dramatically, much faster than wages have increased. So I think an increasing percentage of the population find themselves struggling to make ends meet in a basic way.